Um, Welcome everyone. Since this is the pilot episode of the Bad History podcast. In this podcast, we are going to talk about and try to debunk some of the myths surrounding various parts of history and prehistory. Since this is the pilot episode, we thought it'd be nice to start with prehistory as well. So today we are going to talk about the Solutrean hypothesis and why this is not a really good hypothesis. In other words, why it is bad history. I'm Peter, and joining me for this episode are Ben, Patrick, and James. Ben is the most informed one of us on this subject, so most of the episodes will probably be us asking questions to him. To briefly say what the Solutrean hypothesis is that, as I understand it, it is the idea that North America was initially settled by Solutrean people roughly 15,000 years ago. Solutrean people supposedly lived in roughly France and Spain, and these people would settle America and would eventually turn into what is called the Clovis culture. And the main evidence for this is a similar napping technique. Now, before we go any further, just said a bunch of difficult terms, and some of these terms may be unfamiliar to many of our listeners. So, to start us off, I'd like to ask Ben what all these terms mean. So, Ben, could you explain to us what Solutrean means and what these terms mean? Yeah.
Okay, so we can start off with the Solutrean. So even before we get into what exactly the Solutrean is, there's kind of a lot of theoretical debates over in archaeology how we should classify styles of tools, pottery, stone tools, things like that. Do they actually correlate to real cultures? Are they ethnic groups, things like that? That's a huge debate that can't really is way beyond the scope of this. But just to give a quick overview, it's called European archaeologists have been calling it a stone tool industry, meaning that maybe it's not not a unique or a singular culture, but just a style of tool making that's spread across a large area and is relatively standardized. So the Solutrean is around 22,000 to 17,000 years ago, occurs mostly in Western Europe, and you see it in parts of France and Spain mostly, and parts of Portugal. And in terms of the Solutrean hypothesis, what the specific marker of it is this sort of what they call laurel leaf blade. That's very difficult to make, and there are also a shouldered point, which is basically just a projectile point with a sort of protrusion, which is called the shoulder, that are the diagnostic materials of the Solutrean. And in terms of what it is it's actually less important what the Solutrean is in Europe to the Solutrean hypothesis than how it plays out on the North American continent, really. But does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So, like a laurel leaf is like a type of spear tip or something, like the
It's
shape of
a
the tip.
blade, so yeah, it's a knife. It's usually employed as a
Okay.
knife, and the point would be the shouldered point. Again, this is it's every culture has a huge toolkit, a lot of things going on with settlement patterns, things like that. But describing the entire Solutrean, of course, would be an entire episode by itself.
Yeah,
With
sure.
the important thing are the diagnostic stone tools, because that's what the Solutrean people are going to be arguing about.
Right, and the proponents of the solution hypothesis, they mainly rely on this one piece of evidence, which is the napping techniques used by both, apparently used by Solutreans and by Clovis people, which is called the overshot technique, right?
Yeah. So just to get into that, introducing the term Clovis, we'll probably get into that more with the peopling of the Americas. But so the Clovis is an early Paleo Indian, one of the earliest stone tool technologies, not quite the earliest, but the main thing that they're considering to be a similarity is in those two blades, the Solutrean blade and the Clovis blade, is this overshot technique. So basically, what that means is when you're making a stone tool, you're hitting it with a hammer stone or you're hitting it with something like an antler billet, and normally you're taking off these little things called flakes, almost like you're sculpting the tool. And the overshot technique just means you're hitting a flake so that it shoots around onto the other face of a biface, essentially. So the important thing about that technique is that when you I don't know if I should save this for the debunking part, but that's basically the definition of the overshot. Of I think it's pretty clear that they developed independently, but
Okay,
is
well, we'll
there?
get there later.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to explain the Solutrean hypothesis without just wanting to begin the debunk immediately, honestly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but before we get into the debunking, like, what is the current, more or less, consensus on how that the Solutrean hypothesis is arguing against? What is the current consensus on how people settled or more or less moved into North America?
Without making this sort of a novel.
Yeah, to put it shortly.
Yeah, well, I mean, the quick overview of the evidence is the consensus view is that people crossed from what is now modern day Siberia over Beringia, which was a landmass that was revealed because of during the Ice Age, sea levels were lower. So what you have is a landmass that connects Siberia, modern day Siberia, to modern day Alaska, which allows transportation over from Asia into North America. And basically, what you have is two different models of how this happened. And which one is correct is actually plays into the Solutrean hypothesis a bit. So the first was called the Clovis first model, which is generally rejected now. Going back to the Clovis points, what this said was about 13,000 years ago or so, people crossed over the Bering Land mass into what was called an ice-free corridor, where glaciers opened up. And then that was from that population they peopled the Americas. But that's generally been rejected now because there are a number of sites that have been found to be pre-Clovis. So they're going up to about between 14 and 16,000 years ago, depending on which carbon dates you want to use in particular, or which radiometric dates you want to use. They're generally in that range, like Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, Buttermilk Creek, Monteverde in South America. So what happens then is the new idea is that since that ice-free corridor is not open, people are traveling down what's today west coast of Canada and the U.S. In boats and kind of skipping along the coast until they get down to South America, basically, which is it makes sense because one of those pre-Clovis sites is Monteverde, which is in South America. So they're not just exploding across the continent and then going south through Central America. They're hopping along the coast to get to Monteverde. So that actually makes more sense than the Clovis first model. And that if you accept those dates, and it's also a lot more heterogeneous than what was believed before, where there was this one kind of homogenous Clovis culture, and now you have different pre-Clovis finds and things like that. But it's still there's still not a ton of those finds, but there are enough to establish that to move the consensus towards a pre-Clovis model.
Yeah, and I mean, Monteverde is also in Chile too, which also kind of supports the hypothesis that they're just sort of going down the Pacific coast. And especially in the north in like Alaska and what is now British Columbia. I guess they were sort of, because the ice sheet almost reached the coast in some areas, they were kind of going to like coastal refugia, like that the ice hadn't covered up, and they were sort of living there, and then they moved south again, and so on and so on.
Yeah, pretty much. And
So
I guess I
about the
should just
ice
mention.
sheet.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go in between. About the ice sheet, this was all like taking place with like the latest ice age, or is my question?
It's in terms of big ice ages. I guess you could say that like there's a little ice age in um, during the medieval period, but it's basically the last glacial maximum is what you would call it.
Yeah, okay. But we'll talk more about that later when we get into the supposed crossing of the Solutreans.
Yeah.
So to get back to what this episode is about, um, who came up with the Solutrean hypothesis and what is it about?
So basically, the Solutrean hypothesis says that the Solutrean peoples of Europe migrated from Europe across the Atlantic into North America sometime, I guess, sometime between, like 18,000 years ago. It's never really clear because that's changed a bit over time, but basically that's the nub of it. And the idea has been kind of thrown around for some time, but it never really caught on that much. I think it goes back
Okay.
originally to like maybe the 1920s, and it's mostly survived as sort of a thing that hobbyist flint nappers have thrown around, like, hey, you never ever notice how this one thing kind of looks like this other thing. That's mostly what it's been until Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley started publishing on it in around the late 90s, I believe. And they took that and made a more thorough, I guess, in terms of what had been done before, a more rigorous approach to it, although we'll see that's not really that rigorous at all.
This
And
is not a good sign for the
yeah.
theory in general.
Yeah, and I think the main reason that this gets more traction is because Stanford, who died I think last year, worked at the Smithsonian, and Bruce Bradley is an expert flint napper and archaeologist, and he's kind of like one of a godlike figure for flint nappers. So obviously he builds a lot of credibility, has a lot of independent credibility apart from this hypothesis. So they have some institutional weight behind this, even though
So like,
most other archaeologists have rejected it.
these guys are really well respected, except for this one theory except for this one hypothesis that they have, basically.
Yeah, this was their I guess this was Dennis Stanford's sour note to go out on.
This is like the when you become really old as like an academic and you just sort of like begin making out there theories, and it's just like, what are you doing, old man? I know. It's sort of. I'll let you continue that.
So what part do we want to get into then? What their proposed evidence for it is?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah,
you might as well detail like the one really, actually not that terrible on the surface piece of evidence that they actually have. So, which is the flint napping and the overshoot technique. So maybe if
Okay.
you could explain that just really quickly, and then we'll just immediately start debunking it once you've done explaining it.
Yeah, so like I was talking about with the overshot technique previously, the main piece of evidence that they use, and you can really tell if you read into this that they started with this and then worked backwards from all the other pieces of evidence that they put together, that they latched onto this first and then kind of constructed everything around it, was that the Solutrean laurel leaf style blades and the Clovis blades both use this overshot flint knapping technique to produce. So people use that to produce them, and the thing that makes this somewhat compelling, at least, is that it's a very hard to master technique, and it's a very rare technique. You don't really see it used a lot, and it takes a lot of skill to be able to do it. So if in a vacuum, those two things would be somewhat compelling. If there weren't all these other factors involved, like if they somehow pulled up more diagnostic Solutrean stuff from North America, like if they had one of those shouldered points, I might take a second look at that. Just because that is also so rare, that's one of the problems with this, is that that one technique is what they have rather than any diagnostic Solutrean material. But it is, at least in terms of a thing that you throw around in the bar room, might be like something that's like mildly compelling for a bit, and then you think about it for a second, you're like, nah, it doesn't really work. But that is the one thing that they have, I would say. And then sort of everything else was as I said, worked backward from around that, because they're like, there are other ideas that basically the Solutrean people are living in a fairly cold environment, so they're going to be used to freezing temperatures and stuff, so it won't be horrible for them to learn how to cross the ocean on ice flows. And their other thing is that the Clovis, the actual frequency of Clovis sites, you see more of them in the eastern part of the United States. So obviously, if they're coming from Europe, that's where you would predict that they would be closer to the eastern area of the United States. So the Clovis is all over North America and part of the northern area of southern or South America, but they do tend to cluster in the eastern part of the continental United States, which is something that's kind of puzzled the Clovis first people for a long time, as if why shouldn't they should all be, the mass of them should be clustered maybe on like the west coast toward northwest coast or something like that, at least closer to that area. So that's another thing that's at least consistent, maybe not that compelling, but at least consistent. The next thing that they have is that there seems to be, again, like you said, at first glance, there's a genetic connection between modern Europeans and a certain subset of Native Americans.
Yeah, the X haplogroup and Native Americans have X2A, as far as I know.
But before we get into that, so to briefly recap, like their argument is that like the specific napping technique is so unique that no two people could have invented it independently.
Exactly. Yeah. There could be.
So they must be connected.
Yeah, they have to be connected.
From that logic, they like extrapolated their whole argument. They must be connected, so they must have gone through the ice over the Atlantic.
Exactly. Yeah. They find this connection and then try to, if that connection is true, what would the implications be for how those people got there? And then they have to try to find a way to get them from Western Europe into North America during at the end of the last glacial maximum, essentially, and try to scrounge up some evidence that makes that like a compelling case.
I mean, they did a lot of scrounging, but it's still not very compelling, in my opinion.
That is true. So I am trying to give them a slight amount of credit in that the people who came up with this are not like idiots. They're not, cranks on the internet just yelling about ancient aliens or something. Although, if you want to talk about that, I think there's some compelling similarities between in the roots of this theory and ancient aliens. Just to ad hom them a bit, but so they're not like idiots yelling on the internet. And two, there is at least one piece that should make you like pause for a second and think about it. So it's not, it's not 100% garbage.
Yeah, although there is the slight problem that you sort of notice that the alt-right a lot and racists on the internet, for some people, they really like to attach to this theory that Europeans populated the Americas for a variety of reasons. I'm not saying that the authors are racist. As far as I know, they're still credible academics, but like the theory has gained a lot of popular traction in racist circles, which is honestly kind of odd. And I haven't really read up on my alt-right bullshit dictionary yet, so I'm still not entirely sure why they believe this, but yeah, it's pretty weird, honestly.
Yeah, well, I mean, depending on the direction you want to take this, I think we could look at sort of the larger implications of it once you get into the details of why it's wrong. Um, and because I think some of those details will show why those people are interested in it to some extent. And there's sort of larger theoretical issues at play there. So I don't know if you want to go toward that or just go toward straight what are the problems with this
Yep.
idea.
Well, I mean, we can detail that maybe after we sort of go through the like probably the rigorous academic, well, maybe not rigorous, but the sort of academic debunking stuff. Because
Yeah.
this is kind of a summary of all the evidence that there is against this hypothesis, and there's a lot of it. So this might take a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were about to go into the genetic evidence, so let's get back to that.
Yeah. So the genetic evidence that they present is not the main crutch of the theory. Are you talking about critiquing it, or are we still explaining what their theory is?
what their theory is at first.
Oh, I mean, they basically just have the entirety of their genetic connection is that there's the X haplogroup that's found in Europe that's also found in North America among Native Americans. It's not really more complicated than that. That's pretty much all they have.
But maybe to quickly explain for our viewers who might not be aware of this, what is a haplogroup?
Yeah, that would help. So basically, a haplogroup is just a genetic population that has a common ancestor, and usually that's measured through mitochondrial DNA. So if you remember from high school biology, you have your the cell nucleus has basically the DNA that's actually involved in copying the cell and things like that. But your mitochondria has some copies of maternal DNA, so it's on the maternal line. And the reason why that's used a lot is because there tend to be a lot of copies of it, so it degrades less over time. So that's one of the easiest ways to get archaeogenetic evidence. So basically, if you think of it as a sort of genetic descent group, it's just a fancy term for that, really. You can go into more depth about what a haplogroup being a group of haplotypes and things like that. But I'm not a geneticist, and I don't think that the level of genetics that the Solutrean hypothesis people are working with is also really not that it's not that in depth either.
There's X here and there's X there. Must be connected. There you go. Boom. Done.
I mean, yeah, that's the thrust of all of the hypothesis.
So they suggest that there is a genetic connection between the Solutreans and the Clovis people.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
I read in one of the articles that we don't really have any genetic evidence of the Solutreans, so they tested like modern Europeans and then Native Americans. If I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah, so when you look at trying to map the genetic evidence, one of the issues with that is that you're looking at modern populations. Now you can get there's a lot of archaeogenetic studies where you can trace migrations through ancient DNA, and there are a lot of legitimate studies in that vein. And for whatever reason, no one has. I don't know if they're just the remains are not preserved well enough to do it for this particular period, or maybe just no one has decided to put some money into it for some reason yet. But there are no sequenced. There's no sequenced DNA from Solutrean remains, so we don't really have any idea of what the genetics of the Solutreans look like. And now, so you could still maybe try to get a fuzzy guess through modern populations. Um, but the problem that gets in there that you get with that is that the um, that haplogroup X is it's heaviest in certain parts of Europe, but you can also find it in parts of Asia and um, parts of the Middle East. And the Native American variant of that is called X2A, and apparently the whatever the Eurasian variant of that um, is not actually ancestral to the Native American haplogroup X2A. So what it looks like what happened is that there was probably some admixture at some point where there's back migration or something like that, where similar haplogroups developed, um, but they're not actually connected ancestrally. Again, I'm not a geneticist, so it's not. I can't explain that in a lot of detail, but you can look up Jennifer Raff's work on that. She does a lot of work on archaeogenetics, on ancient DNA, and things like that. That's extremely detailed and easy to read. So that's what I would recommend if you wanted to get into minute detail with it. But I think, again, like I said, I think their main piece of evidence is that flint knapping technique, and they're just working backwards from that. So in a way, a lot of these other things are not the main. They're not as relevant to the main point. They're just kind of add-ons that they've thrown in there to try to find some kind of evidence of a connection.
And I really like how this sort of also exemplifies the theory in the fact that they found two things that sort of look like each other, right? And then, later, more in-depth study kind of proves that they're not really that connected, and then they just sort of, they just sort of, whatever, it's fine, don't worry about it, and then they just keep going on with the theory. I don't really know why, but it's. I mean, at least they're adamant about it.
Okay, yeah, that's that is true. There's it is a classic case of if you squint, these two things kind of look the same, but um, therefore they're connected. But I think the point that we should probably get into, aside from the genetics, is the main part. Like I said, that flint knapping technique. So
Yeah.
that flint knapping technique, the overshot technique, that is what they are really obsessed with. Especially because Bradley, like I said, is a godlike figure in lithic technology, archaeology, and flint knapping communities. So um, basically, they say this technique. Um, they must be connected in some way because there's no way that they could be independently invented. The problem with that is that it looks like it has been independently invented multiple times. Uh, one of the interesting things about that is that there are certain styles in South America that are about contemporary with Clovis. Um, uh, Before or rather, once you get past down northern South America, they're closer to inland and things like that. There's certain styles that have that overshot technique that are overlap in time. So there's even one instance of an independent invention there, and um, there are other stone tool industries or styles that have used that, like certain Neolithic flint daggers to finish off um, to finish off thinning the blade. What you would do is use that overshot technique. So it's definitely not a unique technique. And the other problem with that is even if those two were the only examples that you would only see in Clovis and Solutrean. The problem is that the overshot technique is not, even though it's very rare and requires skill, a lot of skill to use, the basis of that technique is actually not that difficult to figure out in terms of just discovering it, because what an overshot flake um, is the force that's traveling through the piece that you're flint napping is just curving around and basically taking a bigger chunk off than you would normally want. So it's a little bit hard to show without a diagram, but basically the idea is that the overshot, if you have an overshot flake by itself, that's usually a mistake. And when you look at markers of skill in flint napping, you would say usually an overshot, that overshot would be a mistake. So you can discover this by accident pretty much. You can take a piece of stone that you're working, hit it, and then, oh, it's an overshot flake. I messed up. I shouldn't have done that. But then maybe you take that and go, what if I keep doing this over and over again? Like if I have enough control to keep doing this over and over again, I can actually use this to remove little mistakes and imperfections in the stone that I'm working. So it's really a matter of leaping from, oh, I messed up, to, if I tweak this a little bit, I can get to an actual technique. So the technique itself is based on is based on accident almost. So what happens is that it's not terribly crazy to think that it could have been invented twice, even if there were no other instances of it being independently invented. And it's to me that it seems intuitive. If you're it's kind of weird to me that Bradley also, being that he's such a great flint napper, didn't really think of that. Like, it doesn't seem to phase him that it's often a mistake that beginners make. It's just a matter of systematizing that into an actual technique. It is counterintuitive in a way, but it's not. It can be, the basis of it is discovered easily by accident.
Didn't the authors of the Solutrean hypothesis also claim that the overshot technique was a more efficient sort of stone making technique, or that the spear points and and the tools made by that technique were better than not made by that technique, as far as I know?
Well, yeah, they do claim that it's a more efficient way of making tools, but I would say that the experimental evidence on that is kind of mixed. I've seen things that dispute that, but I think regardless of efficiency, it doesn't necessarily produce a better tool. Basically, the important thing is that it gives you a thinner tool. Like, it's a way to finely thin the piece that you're working on. And going back to other instances of this, you can actually see this with the Neolithic daggers. They're also very thin, finely worked, and they're thin to the point where if you make one little mistake, that's going to snap, and the whole thing's going to snap in half. You can't mess up, like, you mess up a tiny little bit, and the whole thing is gone. So it is fair to say that it requires a lot of skill, and they're not necessarily better made either. It depends on what you're using the tool for. That's pretty much, saying something is better made is always context dependent too. But I mean, insofar as it's a highly skilled way of making tools, that's definitely true.
Okay, so we've tackled the napping as well as the genetic evidence. So I guess now we might as well move on to, the crossing and sort of the whole seafaring bit, because
Now,
that's also
before we get into that, I think it might be nice to point out, like, even though that there is a somewhat similarity between the flint napping, there was also the thing that the Solutrean culture and the culture of the Clovis people are not really alike in any other way. It's like they have somewhat similar knives, but if they were like descendant of one another, then there would be more similarities. Could you expand more into that, Ben?
Yeah, and that does connect to the Atlantic crossing to because if you're looking at a migration, one of the classic ways to detect a migration is when you have a sort of package of things that's coming together from one place to another. Obviously, people are going to change as they migrate over to different places, but you should expect a lot more similarities than what you see with the Solutrean. So basically, what they're saying is these people had to, before you even get into the physical implausibility of getting across the Atlantic, you're saying these fairly small groups of people who are probably not going to they're not going to be inventing a lot of they don't have much room to invent a lot of new things when they're making this treacherous crossing, in terms of there's not like a ton of raw material to work with just sitting around and on ice floes and things like that. Um, so they're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of innovation. So what you'd expect is when they finally get to North America, when they have the means to make stuff again, that they're probably going to be pretty culturally similar. Um, and that's really, like you said, the only similarity we see is not even uh, in the blades themselves, like the morphology of the blades. Um, so stone the like those stone blades, a lot of them will look fairly similar because there's only so many ways to make a blade. You need to have the two working edges, so or if you have like a blade a working edge at least. So they don't look completely different, but they're not even morphologically like identical in their style. All they have in common is that technique, and the rest of their cultural package, if you will, the rest of their material culture doesn't match up at all. Like outside of things that everyone is going to have, like everyone's going to have waste flakes and you know. Um, things like that, but they don't have, one of the things that the Solutreans did was they was rock art, which you don't see. You do see rock art in North America. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if there's any dated to the Paleo-Indian period, but you don't really see. There's far less of it in Eastern North America. The center of rock art is really Southwest, and all that stuff is very well dated to very specific cultural groups and attributed to them. Whereas in the Northeast, you don't really see anything that's similar to Solutrean. You don't really see anything that's much of it that's at the same time as Solutrean. So it's like um, there's none of that. And again, going back to the shouldered points, that's one of the classic markers of the Solutrean style. So why did they give up on those shouldered points and make a point that was different in shape and style than those shoulder points? Um, so they have basically none of the same material culture as the Solutreans outside of that one technique and things that you would find regardless of where you're looking, of very basic tools.
Yeah,
So,
so we'll,
like,
we'll we'll just assume they all had amnesia on the trip and they just sort of forgot everything except that one overshot technique, I guess.
Yeah, they remembered how to do that, which is, now that I think of it, it's funny because that would be the hardest thing to replicate.
Yeah, I mean, like they're crossing the Atlantic and they have no stone. Like, how are they gonna? Like, of all the things you'd probably forget how to do this like stone making technique. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe going back to what you said, if they somehow made it across, they kind of forgot how to make stone. They made a lot of beginners' mistakes and they decided to do the whole overshot thing again because it was, well, they just saw how to do it because on accident, I guess. Who knows? But I guess we can now detail why the crossing is pretty fucking unlikely.
Yeah, so part of the lack of raw material for stone that's one of them. So presumably, what they're doing is they're hopping across ice floes in some fashion, and I guess pretty much what they're subsisting mostly on seals or other nearby marine life. I guess fish and seals mostly. So what they're going to have to make is with bone tools. They're going to have to use like entirely bone tools for everything, pretty much. I mean, you might carry some material with you from Europe, but that's going to run out pretty fast. Uh,
Yeah, and I mean, I can't
and
imagine how easy it would be to carry just like a whole bag full of just like stone and firewood from Europe just across all of the North Atlantic for no particular reason, anyway. If if we're to believe the Solutrean hypothesis.
Yeah,
Yeah, and one of the big problems with that is that the current is actually running against them in the way that Stanford and Bradley propose. They went across the Atlantic. So I think in some of their later stuff, they've tried to hand wave that by saying that, well, they must have had boats, which is fair enough. I mean, probably the Solutreans probably had some kind of boats, but not did they. It's not only that they had boats, but they also had um, decent. They had sails and they had a decent knowledge of sailing technology, because what they did was to go to go against the current and against the winds, they would tack back and forth very quickly. So they're already like expert sailors too.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to be able to know how to like build a canoe and build a raft. It's another thing to be able to sail across the open Atlantic to North America, across pack ice, and not get hit by an iceberg or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and
yeah,
it's unclear how open the Atlantic is too, and because they kind of go back and forth between, maybe at some points they were using boats, maybe at some points they were
Walking
hopping
across.
across ice flows. Yeah, they're like ice flow hopping. The thing is that those ice flows last. Those ice flows probably lasted at that time that they're saying that they hopped across, maybe a 1 to 2 month period. So they'd have 1 to 2 months to figure out an entirely new route if they wanted to stick to the flows. So it's like, I mean, they basically have the amount of length that it took Columbus to get to the Americas. With, obviously there's difference in distance because they're not going from the same starting point, but you're also looking at a guy with early modern sailing technology, I guess, versus people who have just invented sailing, being able to attack against currents, live in in near Arctic temperatures, with almost no way to get provisions, um, not really any wood if something happens to their boat. It's just none of it makes any sense, really.
Yeah, it's. I mean, um, and the a lot of the actual like evidence for the sea, it's like you detailed. I think the Bay of Biscay said that it was only really a bit frozen for like 1 to 3 months of the year. There's not a lot. There's also, I think they also claim that they sort of walked on some sections across the sort of sea ice plain following the harp seals. And they also justified this by saying that the coastal ice border areas of, generally speaking, that we can see today are very productive regions with lots of animals and stuff like that. However, there's a bit of a criticism in that they're not like just in the coastal, ice border regions. They're also crossing the open ocean, which is a pretty unproductive region in general for most things, and so there's not really going to be a lot of food or a lot of incentive to go over there. Um, and as well as that, I think they also detailed this sort of giant kind of hole in the middle of the North Atlantic ice sheet, or sort of the evidence points that there's kind of a hole there, which would sort of imply that if they were following the ice border to follow the seals, they would be going north instead of going west, which is sort of another hole in the hypothesis. But I don't know how they
yeah.
handle that. But yeah, it's
To
not
to
it's not good.
quickly more explain their theory, because their theory is like that the Solutreans were a more naval culture, And even though there isn't really a lot of evidence for that, but there has been like found within Solutrean remains that there are some seal bones. So, but this is, I think, only one or two instances. And then their theory is that these Solutrean peoples migrated across the edge of the ice from what is now Western France all the way to Canada and America. Because at this time, like the land ice from the North Pole southwards was all the way very far to the south. Like in Europe, it was all the way up to Ireland, the UK, and then straight across the Low Countries in Germany. And then even in North America, it was even further south.
Yeah, North America had
So
reached like Chicago, I think, at one point almost. By this point, I think the Laurentide ice sheet in North America had covered like basically all of Newfoundland and also New Brunswick. So another problem with the solution hypothesis that I read up is that once they got to America, it's a bit unclear if they would have sort of the same kind of thing as the as what we think the Siberians had when they were crossing into North America from the other side, in that they would have the sort of very productive kelp forest coastal region with lots of animals, and the refugia from the glacier would have pretty decent environment to live in. Or, yeah, but however, in the east, we don't really know if they kind of had something somewhat similar to that, or if they just sort of had a coastal desert with winds coming in off the glacier, just chilling them to the bone and kind of making the whole place a polar desert, which is not exactly, again, not an ideal place to live on in general.
Yeah, I mean, the you can get into that too. It's just like uh, the unlikelihood of even getting there in the first place is like almost seems to make that an irrelevant point at the point we're getting at.
Yeah, and I mean, I just imagine like if the solution hypothesis is valid, I just imagine like the big brain, visionary guy in like southern France who says to all the other solutions, "Hey, let's go on the pack ice and hunt the seals. What's the worst that could happen?" And they just get like why would anyone follow that? I mean, like as far as I know, the Eurasian steppe at that point in time was a pretty productive place. I don't really see why they would think that seals were the main would be better than what they already had in southern France, and they would have to live on pack ice, um, only use bone tools. Apparently, they would have to use like seal fat as a fuel source for literally everything. Um, Not entirely sure how they would get sparks too, but whatever. Um, stone is non-existent. Wood is non-existent. So yeah, it just seems like a much harder lifestyle for not really particularly any gain, really, unless they somehow know that there's going to be an America waiting for them in like I don't know how long the Solutreans took to get to North America under the hypothesis.
yeah,
Yeah,
for
well,
the
it's
hypothesis to
go
be
ahead.
valid, they like they would have had to turn into like a full-on seal hunting culture,
Yeah,
cross the Atlantic, and then turn back into their old culture when they were back on dry land
and
again. But
specifically
then
remember this one
forget,
technique,
yeah, forget everything about their old culture except for how to make these knives.
which they haven't done in years, presumably since they've just been using bone tools.
Yeah, so um, the the thing is that the reason that people migrate is only to increase their food returns or things like that. So you could come up with a plausible reason of not necessarily why someone would cross the Atlantic, try to cross the Atlantic like this, but let's say you have two groups and there's some kind of political dispute, and then a lot of times what you see with hunter gatherers is one mode of conflict resolution is just picking up stakes and moving over somewhere else instead of trying to stick it out and possibly get into a violent conflict with part of your own group or another neighboring group. Um, So there might be political delimitation of resources going on, where they're like, okay, we got to move and get somewhere else, even if that somewhere else is not as productive as where we are. The leap there is that the population density in Europe at that time is so low. I mean, this is Paleolithic Europe. There's
Yeah,
plenty of other places to move to without just hopping ice floes all across
yeah.
the Atlantic.
I mean,
Like,
I think I heard this the sort of statistic that in I think Paleolithic Britain. So this is way after this period, but in Paleolithic Britain, once the ice had retreated, there were only like 20,000 people in all of Britain, which is like the population of a small town, more or less. So yeah, that kind of shows. Yeah, so like even if there was like a dispute, you could just like move over to another valley somewhere in France rather than go across the Atlantic on sea ice. And again, as we detailed, like the North Atlantic is a pretty terrible place if you want to have lots of food returns. Like maybe the coast is decent, probably, but again, the actual open ocean is not a good place to get food. So that would probably be the place where the Solutreans, if they were this like big seal hunting group, would probably stop their sort of migration and just sort of stick to these sort of coastal-ish areas, I guess.
yeah, if anything, you'd expect them, if they were gonna go that far, they'd end up probably in Britain, uh, rather than going across the entire Atlantic. And
Yeah.
and you could say maybe they tried to island hop there, but like there's no Solutrean finds in Britain, and really the only way you can hand wave that away is just say, well, they haven't been found yet, which you
they,
can do to prove
they
almost anything
they
you
tried
want.
to get to Britain, but they had a very poor sense of geography, so they accidentally ended up in North America. Oops.
Yeah,
Okay, and then yeah, so we've kind of dealt with all of the evidence actually about the solution hypothesis. So it's once again, it's not looking good for the solution hypothesis. Really, there's a lot of holes. They're really big, and the one thing that is like kind of maybe sort of perhaps a connection, the flint knapping technique is. There's also a lot of small holes in there. So basically, honestly, this theory is more holes than actual substance, in my opinion.
Yeah,
yeah, I
Ben,
wouldn't dispute that at all.
you mentioned earlier that there was like one piece of evidence that would like make you raise an eyebrow. Is that? Could you go into that more?
Oh, I just said if that they had found a shouldered point like you would find in the European Solutrean on the American continent. I mean, it's still hugely unlikely. All the evidence seems to be stacked against it, but I don't know, like if they could find that with the napping technique and that particular style associated together, that would be at least something to go on. Um, but they don't have that, so I don't. Uh, it's not really relevant as of now. It's just that it's trying to give them as much credit as possible there.
Yeah, so also like in one of the articles that I read about this, like for this to be considered a more legitimate theory, it would have to be like more evidence than just the napping. There would have to be other cultural similarities, and there would also have to be like some more plausible way of how they crossed the Atlantic, because it sounds kind of ridiculous. And was there something else that we were saving for last? Maybe like the political implications.
Oh yeah, right. The yeah. So I think you detailed this in an earlier discussion we had, Snuggle, but sort of the implications of the solution hypothesis and that if the solution sort of survived in some aspects or another kind of depends on how racist you are. Like the authors are not. So I think they said that the solution sort of just like died out in America and they were sort of kind of replaced, I guess, by Paleo Indians. But the alt right, and maybe they left like some genetic markers with haplogroup X2A, but as we've detailed, that's pretty unlikely. But the alt-right likes to claim that Europeans colonized America, so something something European colonization of Paleo-Indians is totally justified, and/or I don't know, maybe that Native and Paleo-Indians wiped out the Solutreans, so Europeans can exact revenge or something. I don't know. It's it's kind of weird, their fascination with this theory.
More like a "we were here first, so
Yes,
it all
basically, yeah,
belongs
basically,
to
we
us
were here
anyway."
first, so we can take over your land again because we were here first. So shut up about it.
I mean, yeah, that's the short of it. A little bit more in-depth analysis is, I guess, you can just call a lot of them "we were here first" theories. It goes back to really, if you want to go back to early American archaeology, like American archaeology was literally just based around uh, essentially trying to discredit Native American cultural achievements, because the first excavation that could be, it wasn't professional at the time, but what could be considered a archaeological excavation was done by Thomas Jefferson. um, and there are a lot of there's monumental architecture in the form of giant earthworks and mounds, in a lot of the Midwest, parts of the Southeast, and Southern United States, even stretching into a little bit of the Northeast and things like that. So the question was, who built these things? And
Lost tribes of Israel.
Jefferson, yep, well, that's the Mormon answer to it.
Oh god. I still can't believe Mormon archaeology is still somehow its own little subfield that just sort of like publishes itself in only Utah and is still that archaeologists just kind of have to deal with as a thing that exists. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, they're kind of penned off into Brigham Young Quarterly, but so all kinds of ideas start springing up around this, and it's like, interestingly, Thomas Jefferson was ahead of the curve on this and said, "Well, these were obviously built by Native Americans." And then opinion turned against Jefferson for quite a while of just all these different theories that it was some lost white race, that there was that it was tribes of Israel, basically anything you could think of. And the closest one that was still wrong was that there was some kind of ancient migration from Mesoamerica that built these things, which at
Right.
least gives it to the Native Americans, even if that was wrong.
So yeah,
Um,
it's not racist against Native Americans as a whole, only North American ones, which is kind of an
yeah,
improvement, I guess. Not really, but it's something. Uh, yeah, and I mean, I don't know. The thing I notice about all of these sort of like Native Americans couldn't have built this or Africans couldn't have built this theories of the 19th century. It's either lost tribes of Israel or the Phoenicians or some other like notable seafaring group that somehow got to this like far off place for no real reason, but is just sort of credited with building this, even though it looks nothing like their architectural style at all, just because, well, they're white and they sailed a lot and we don't know where they went, so whatever, they probably built it or something, you know.
yeah,
Hmm.
that's true. So, and then there's another sort of intellectual artifact of that age, moving more into the 19th century. Um, that was called hyperdiffusionism. So there's, in kind of old timey archaeology, the theory was that you had three mechanisms of cultural change. You had invention, you had diffusion, and you had migration. And the thing is, a lot of the archaeologists at the time tended to focus on migration and diffusion more than invention. There's kind of an interesting theoretical background in that, in the sense that there are kind of two opposing schools of evolutionism versus culture history, where one side said basically almost everything is independent invention, and the other side says almost everything is diffusion or migration. So I think this is obviously in that hyperdiffusionist school, where hyperdiffusionism is diffusionism taken to its most logical extreme, where you say anything that exists can only be invented once, and it has to diffuse out from there. And I think that the Solutrean is a classic case of that, where it could have only been invented once. So if two things look similar, they have to be connected in some way. And going back to what I was saying earlier, obviously, like Ancient Aliens is kind of like the most cartoonish version of that, where it could have only been invented once, and aliens did it.
Yeah, unless white people did it. In that case, that's just the achievements of the white race. I mean, we can't do anything about that. But if brown people did it, then that's obviously aliens because they're not smart enough to do any of this stuff.
Yeah, I guess you could say there's also a third strand there, which is the less uh, one that's less about a bit less about racialism and just more about at the time where um, what technology archaeologists had available to them, like late 19th, early 20th century. There was a kind of a controversy called the Pleistocene Man or Paleolithic America controversy, um, over the similarities in certain stone tools that they called turtlebacks, which were just kind of crude knife-like implements. Um, and the reason why no one could work really that debate couldn't really be settled until much later was just because there was no radiometric dating. So it was like, was there an equivalent Paleolithic in the Americas as there was to Europe? And now, just because we have radiometric dating, that's been pretty much settled. But if you go back to the time, I think it was a perfectly legitimate debate at the time. It was just that they didn't have the technology to resolve it. But that kind of is stuck around, and that people are still looking for that Paleolithic America evidence. That, and I think the Solutrean also fits into that, is that old fashioned, obsolete kind of theoretical paradigm where you want to find something that's equivalent to the European Paleolithic in North America.
Right. So basically, the standard of Paleolithic, I guess, is the European standard, and you kind of need to find evidence that fits that model in order to prove something. Prove what exactly, actually?
I mean, just prove the time depth of habitation in the U.S. Like I said, I think a lot of that was fairly esoteric argumentation that has just been resolved by radiometric dating. But at the time, it was like um, it would have been difficult to really figure that out at the time. Although I do believe, if I recall correctly, Lewis Henry Morgan did work out the Beringia hypothesis through historical linguistics. I want to say, I don't remember exactly what date he put it at, but it was pretty interesting that he worked that out so early on.
That's quite impressive, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have anything else to discuss?
I would like to ask if Ben has any literature or any specific book that he wants to recommend to people if they want to learn more about how North America was peopled, to say it. So if you have anything in mind or that you'd like to share for our listeners who might be more interested in this subject.
I think the biggest synthesis recently that's been done is David Meltzer's First Peoples in a New World. Um, Meltzer is also one of the critics of the Solutrean hypothesis, and his publications, generally, if you search Meltzer plus Solutrean, you're going to come up with a bunch of his papers debunking the Solutrean. But he's also written this big synthesis of all of the research on the first peopling of the Americas. That would be what I would go to as a good source for that. There's a lot of research on it, but that's probably the easiest entry point.
Okay, then I want to thank you all for participating, specifically Ben for being our resident expert for today. And I want to thank our listeners for being here and listening to us. And depending on how well this episode is received, there might even be a next time for this podcast. Lastly, if any of you have heard us make any mistakes, then please feel free to point them out. We encourage nitpicking, and we hope everybody is more informed about how North America was at least not settled after listening to this episode. So maybe till next time. Bye.
Goodbye.